My name is Gregory Vincent, and I serve as Vice President for Diversity and Community Engagement here at the University of Texas at Austin. And it is my distinct honor to welcome you as we begin our celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Heman Sweatt Symposium. Today is very special to us because we actually have family members from the Sweatt family to come and join us and participate in these beginning programs. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce you all to this very impressive family. And we should all be grateful for their contributions to this great university. First, we have Mr. Heman Marion Sweatt, the great nephew of Heman Sweatt. Dr. James Sweatt III, the nephew of Heman Sweatt. And his wife, Mary Lowe. We also have Dr. William H. Sweatt, the great nephew of Heman Sweatt. His wife, Anna. And his children. We have a special gift for you. We have Dr. Sweatt and Anna's children, Katerina. Christina. And William Manuel.
All right.
Before I talk about the purpose of the symposium and why it was started 35 years ago, more than 35 years ago, I want to talk first about the significance of the Sweatt decision. I think we all have heard or you've heard stated that the Brown versus Board of Education decision was perhaps the most important case of the 20th century and one of the most important cases in American jurisprudence, and I believe that is true. But what is also true is that you do not get to Brown without the Heman Sweatt decision. Because in order to knock down that unanimous decision of Plessy versus Ferguson that talked about Sweatt v. Painter and legitimize state-sponsored segregation, you had to make sure that everyone understood that that law was wrong. And in some ways, you said, why not separate but equal? And what the Sweatt decision did, besides integrating this great institution, it made people understand that equality was not just brick and mortar. There are intangible benefits of coming to a school like the University of Texas at Austin that mere financial expenditures could not measure. And the court spoke to the notion of prestige, the access to outstanding professors, and access to colleagues who would soon become members of the judiciary, lead law firms, and become lawyers and civic leaders. That access was an essential part of that equality. Heman Marion Sweatt understood that, and that's the reason why he wanted to come to this university, because this university was established by the Texas legislature in 1883 to serve the people of Texas. Not some of the people, all of the people. And what this case did was establish that indeed this university was for all of the people of Texas. And so for that, this case has incredible significance. This case is also important because it stands for the epitome of moral courage. By all accounts, and our outstanding speaker will speak to this, Heman Sweatt was a modest, unassuming man. But he wanted to do what all of us wanted to do, which is to pursue his dream of a quality education at his university. That's all he wanted to do. And yet, because of this incredible state-sponsored barrier, he could not do that. And he had the moral courage to stand up and fight for what is right. And because of his moral courage, he made it easier for all of us. And we are all here today because of his moral courage. That is coupled with, and again, you'll hear more about these outstanding individuals, those pioneers who integrated this institution. And they did it with grace, and they did it with excellence. And that's why we're celebrating this symposium and celebrating this event. And I'm so excited about this celebration. I just want to take a moment to congratulate the committee. You all are outstanding. You all have outdone yourselves. I'm just so proud of the work you're doing and the fact that we're going to have the opportunity throughout the spring to give this momentous occasion the attention that it deserves. And to start off, I have the honor of introducing my friend and colleague, Gary Lavergne. Now, if you hear him introduce himself, he will always say he's just a Cajun boy from Louisiana. Is that right there?
That's right.
That's right. But if you read his work, and if you had the honor or pleasure working with him, he is certainly that. And he has all of the wonderful charm. He's never met a stranger. And all of that is true. But what is also true is that he has put all of his professionalism and skill to give notice and to bring to our attention this great American story. This story about a man who wanted to make sure that he could live the American dream. And much like Rosa Parks, who said, I want to be a citizen in its fullest sense. That's what Heman Sweatt wanted. And Gary has given this great story the attention it deserves. He has highlighted outstanding facts, and he has given it great love. And it is my honor to bring to you Gary Lavergne, who will speak about the book. Well, I will ask, since we have exceeded capacity, which is always a good thing, that's never a problem, maybe for the fire marshals, but for us. And we're asking DDC staff if we can let our guests sit down, so I would appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to bring Gary Lavergne to the podium to speak about this outstanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, it just happens all the time. The staff people have to just get up and move. I'll give you a moment here. I have some pretty good news. Before Brown, I found out last week, before Brown was chosen as the Tullis Prize for Best Book on Texas History for 2010. So that's very nice, but there's some money that comes with that too, you know. So anyway, this is a great day for the University of Texas, and it's a great day because we are I'm going to do justice to a story that from the very beginning I was determined was going to be told. In reviewing this book for the Austin American Statesman, Tom Russell wrote that, and he's a law professor, he said that many of his law students tended to believe that Brown versus Board of Education was a spontaneous event brought about by a bunch of old white guys in robes. And that's not what happened. It was a linear progression to an event which is Brown versus Board of Education. And I don't want for a second for anyone to believe that I'm minimizing Brown v. Board of Education. It speaks for itself. But what I will say is that before Brown could happen, you had to have other events that made it possible. And it begins in 1912 in Houston, where Heman Marion Sweatt was born to James Leonard Sweatt Sr. and Ella Rose Perry. The Perry family themselves were a fascinating family as well, a very accomplished people. But, and I think we'll find out tonight when we do the panel discussion with the members of the Sweatt family who are here, as an outsider, as an historian, someone who looked into this fascinating story, it just seems to me that the key to all of the success that we're going to hear about today is actually, has its roots in James Leonard Sweatt Sr., the guy called Papa Sweatt. And all of the family members that I talk about speak of this man with great reverence. When he died in the 1950s, his obituary in the Houston Informer said that he was a great prophet. And so I was very, very fascinated with Papa Sweatt and how Heman said, "My father was quite an historian and he taught me the subject at the table. He was very sensitive and informed on the issues." And the one thing that Hemela Sweatt, I spoke to her last night on the telephone, and she was saying that to her, what she heard about Papa Sweatt was that nothing was more important than an education. Whatever comes in second was so far distant that it didn't really matter. And so I looked at the Heman Sweatt story from a standpoint of what makes what he managed to do possible. And so my book focuses on three supporting structures: preachers, teachers, and newspapers, and how those three things brought about an organizational machinery that first emerged in the struggle for voting rights for African Americans in Texas, which had its disenfranchisement roots in the Terrell election laws of the early 1920s. And so first, let's look at preachers. Heman Marion Sweatt grew up in the 3rd Ward in Houston. And in Houston, we have to look upon that neighborhood as extraordinarily religious. They were a church-going people. 46% of churches in the Houston metropolitan area in 1936 were African American, even though African Americans made up only 21% of the population. My favorite of the preachers is the Reverend Albert Lucas. Thurgood Marshall himself said that Lucas was, quote, "one of the finest gentlemen you'd ever run across. In the glove compartment of his car, he had 2 items, a Bible and a .45 caliber pistol. And his answer was very simple: I'll try the Bible first." He was more than just a joke. He was the individual who located the plaintiff in Smith v. Allwright. And for those of you who know Little Texas history, this dentist here, Dr. Lonnie Smith, is the plaintiff in Smith v. Allwright, and this was the case that opened up Democratic Party primaries to black voters everywhere in the South. At the time, Texas was one-party bifactionalism, and what that meant was the Supreme Court at the time basically said that a Democratic Party could define who its members were. And if you can do that, then you can decide who votes in those primaries. And in Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama, there was only one party. So African Americans were denied the right to vote in the only election that counted. In my native state of Louisiana, there were no Republicans. There were just Democrats. You were either Long, as in Huey P. Long, or anti-long. And so what you have here is being excluded from an election that in fact chose the person who was going to be in office. And so this case had a plaintiff that the Reverend Albert Lucas found in his church in the Good Hope Baptist Church in Houston. Thurgood Marshall himself said that 90% or 80 to 90% of the meetings that he had as an activist for the NAACP took place in black churches. Teachers. Heman Sweatt went to Wiley College, and while he was there, one of the most famous teachers around was a guy named Melvin Tolson, who was made famous by Denzel Washington in the movie The Great Debaters. Heman Sweatt was a student at Wiley at that time, although he was not one of the great debaters himself. But when he was asked, who are the great influences in your life, he said, number one, Papa Sweatt. Number two, a Wiley teacher named Melvin Tolson, long before he became known as the great debater. My favorite Tolson quote is this: "Who said, 'This is white man's country'? A Negro who thinks this country, the United States, is not his country is a damned fool. My native land, where is it? It's where my mother gave me birth. My hometown is where I was born. Jesus was a Nazarene because he was born in Nazareth. I'm just as American as President Roosevelt." Newspapers. Black-owned newspapers were more than just sources of news and chronicles of events. They were a validation of the accomplishment of African and Texans. Secular versions of the church. They published stories about smart kids, accomplished artists, successful businessmen, educators, doctors, lawyers, scientists, heroes, and pretty girls who were also black. While white Texas relegated black children to grossly underfunded elementary and secondary schools and provided no meaningful higher educational opportunities, it was black newspapers who reminded readers that they should not accept racist notions, and it was the only source of information that they could trust and they could count on. Just a sampling of some of these very courageous editors included Clifton Richardson Sr. and Clifton Jr. The young man on the bottom is really the only source of information we have for the famous encounter of Sweatt versus Painter. Heman Marion Sweatt and an NAACP delegation walked down the hallway of the tower across to a room across the hall from where my office is today, in room 1, which is the registrar's office. And the young man at the bottom took notes. And his is the only account that we have of that famous meeting. And no one that I know of has ever questioned its authenticity or its accuracy. But during the Sweatt saga, the newspaper editor who is most influential is Carter Walker Wesley. He owned and operated the Houston Informer and Texas Freeman, which is still in publication today. And he expanded its reach to not only in Houston, but to several cities throughout Texas and throughout the South. He was a very complicated man. Frankly, he was very, very difficult to get along with. But you know, strong people are that way sometimes. And then we have the emergence of the black lawyer, Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the dean of Howard Law School, basically told his students, "Men, you've got to be social engineers." He's famous for having said a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. And one of his students was the tall, skinny guy from Maryland named Thurgood Marshall. And it was Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston who pulled off one of the major upsets in the fight for full citizenship rights for African Americans. Murray v. Maryland, in which Donald Murray was ordered to be admitted to the University of Maryland Law School. In Texas, the black lawyer who became Heman Sweatt's lawyer, according to the record, was William J. Durham of Dallas. The legendary Dallas County District Attorney Henry Wade once said, "He is as good or better than any other lawyer I have worked against in this office." Now we're talking about a district attorney who has been up against some of the finest defense attorneys in the United States, Melvin Belli included. Okay. The first case in this linear progression is Missouri ex rel Gaines versus Canada. It's significant because the Supreme Court ruled, this was Charles Hamilton Houston's case, that Lloyd Gaines, who had applied for the University of Missouri School of Law, they ruled that Gaines's right to an education was a personal and an individual one. Now, why does that matter? Why does it make a difference? It matters because the Supreme Court took away a state's argument that, well, we don't have enough blacks who are interested in the law to justify building a whole law school for them. So now, with this ruling, the Supreme Court essentially said, if you have one and you want to keep him out of your white law school, you got to build one for him. Okay? Secondly, the Supreme Court struck down the practice. The Supreme Court struck down the practice of using out-of-state scholarships to send the state's most talented and gifted African American students away. It is hard to believe. You have to remember that before I came here to the University of Texas, I worked for the College Board. And before that, I worked for ACT. And it was my job to go to several different states. And all of the states I've ever worked in complained that they were, quote unquote, losing their best and brightest. Texas, today, okay? And when I go to the legislature, I hear it all the time. We're losing the best and brightest to Louisiana and Oklahoma, and I hear that. At one time, this state used to pay some of its best and brightest to leave because they were black. Now, Jim Crow states could do one of two things. They could either open their universities and professional schools to everyone, or they could establish duplicates of every program offered to its Anglo population. Now you would think that somebody would say to themselves, that's going to cost a lot of money. And you would think that it's such a ridiculous idea that no one would entertain it or take it seriously. And yet, Missouri did exactly that. They ordered that a separate law school for African Americans be opened by September 1st, 1939. In October of 1939, Charles Houston was preparing for another round of litigation because his client felt that that was unacceptable. When he went back to Missouri, he found out that Lloyd Gaines had not been heard from in over 7 months. And by January of 1940, no one knew where he was. He had disappeared. So the judge dismissed the case because according to the rules at the time, he had to be open for deposition. They couldn't find him, and so the judge dismissed the case, and since that time, Lloyd Gaines has never been heard from again. It is still a mystery as to what happened to him. It would be easy for us to just assume the worst and that he, had been taken or maybe even murdered. We just don't know. I can say this, that at the time, Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston did not think, it's clear in their correspondence, they didn't think that he was a victim of foul play. But we just don't know. We don't know what happened to that young man. But what it illustrates, though, is that the choosing of a plaintiff is serious business. It's serious business for a number of things. you don't know what's going to happen to the guy. It's a very frightening thing. It takes courage. There's one of two things that happen, either foul play or he skipped town. Either way, the choosing of a plaintiff is a serious matter. You have to choose someone, number one, who's qualified to be a plaintiff in the first place, and then secondly, someone who can take it. Someone with the courage to see this through. We're not talking about an afternoon walk in the park here. We're talking about a person deciding that he is going to have his name, or she, in this case, have his name associated with 4 years of very, very bitter litigation for civil rights in the old Confederacy. This is serious stuff. Ada Loy Sipuel in Oklahoma, and her case went to the Supreme Court, is very significant because the Supreme Court ruled that in her case, Oklahoma couldn't put off building a law school for her. See, the idea was, well, okay, we have 2 or 3 African Americans who want to become lawyers, and we're going to have a law school for them, but you know, it's going to take a while. It's going to take years to build the kind of separate but equal law school that will satisfy the courts in Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court said, no, no, no. You've got to provide this at the same time you're providing it to everybody else, as soon as it does for applicants of any other group. Back home in Texas, we have a situation where even within the African American community, we have division and arguments, and sometimes the arguments were very, very bitter and tense. It was probably for me the most educational experience of researching this particular book. When you're a guy like me who grows up in the South, you tend to have it conditioned in your mind that African Americans, who, especially the activists, are all thinking the same thing, thinking the same way. I grew up believing, like everybody else, that, like most other people, that, you know, it's just a few troublemakers who are causing all of this. You know, we heard this. The truth is that even within the African American communities, there was a great debate that was bitter over what is the best way to secure educational and civil rights for the black community. The equalization crowd favored an infusion of funds to significantly improve black institutions. I find it very, very fascinating that in the 4 years Sweatt versus Painter was litigated, the state of Texas spent more money on what was called Negro education back then than they had in their entire previous history. There were many reasonable African American leaders who said, wait a minute, this is not a bad thing. African Americans had been promised a university in the Constitution of 1876, and it wasn't until the late 1940s that construction actually began. And now Thurgood Marshall and the integration crowd was saying, wait a minute now, it's not a good idea to be bought off either. And so what I found fascinating was the letters that went back and forth between the integration and the equalization crowd. Thurgood Marshall, representing integration, said, "It is one thing to take segregation that is forced upon you, and it is another thing to ask for it." Carter Wesley said, "Marshall, you're a stupid man with a stupid idea, and you're a damned ingrate, and the NAACP can go to hell." He put that in his letters, okay? While all of this was going on, Price Daniels, the Attorney General for the state of Texas, was saying, you know, we wouldn't have any of these problems if it wasn't for those New York people coming down here and causing all of these problems here. And the suggestion was that it was Thurgood Marshall who was coming down here and telling everybody what to do. Leave us alone. Well, the truth is exactly the opposite. Thurgood Marshall had a huge problem keeping all these Texans in lines because, you know, I don't know if you know this, but Texans can be hard-headed at times. See, well, okay, you know. No, it wasn't that way at all. I mean, so the one thing that both sides could agree upon, and if he had done nothing else but this, Heman Marion Sweatt deserves to be in the pantheon of civil rights leaders. The one thing both sides could agree on was that if Heman Marion Sweatt wanted to go to the University of Texas Law School, he should be able to go. He was the one unifying force that brought all of these ideas together. But before he became a plaintiff, the NAACP had trouble finding the perfect person for that. The prevailing view at the time was that Lloyd Gaines had skipped town. Couldn't find him. That he was generally an unreliable plaintiff. And he cost the NAACP about $25,000 in 1930s dollars, and that was a lot of money. Who can we trust to go through this for 4 years? So the NAACP formed a committee in July of 1945 to find a plaintiff. In the first week of August, William Durham, wrote, "The plaintiff is our biggest worry." On September 26th, they still hadn't found an acceptable plaintiff, and Marshall said, well, maybe we should give up on trying to desegregate the law school. Maybe we should look at the lower grades instead. But they didn't want to do that because now you're dealing with children and their parents and the emotion that all of that brings. It happened in this church on Dowling Street in Houston. It's still there. And this lady, Lula Bell Madison White, was conducting a meeting. She said what was going on. She asked for a plaintiff. And in the meeting room right next to the sanctuary of this church, a guy about this tall, I guess, might have weighed 120, 130 pounds, stands up and says, I'll do it. And his name was Heman Marion Sweatt. And this is a picture of Sweatt right about that time with his father. Here's Papa Sweatt and his mother and his wife Connie. Lula White writes a letter to Marshall and says, I think I have a plaintiff for the education case. Durham informs Marshall that Sweatt has agreed to file a suit. And the first thing they did was go over all of Sweatt's educational records. They wanted to make sure that this guy was eligible to be admitted to the University of Texas Law School, and that the only reason this university could deny him was for the fact that he was African American. And I write in my book, and as an admissions officer, I find this especially poignant. Never in the history of this university has so much effort gone into an application for the specific purpose of being denied. Now, my office is in Main 7 where the admissions office is, and I see people come in with some of the most creative appeals you'll ever see. But in this particular case, line by line, his transcript from Wiley, line by line. And another thing, I'm probably making too big a deal out of this because back then, all you needed to be admitted to UT Law School was a degree from a certified 4-year institution. And that was it. It's a lot more competitive now, but back then that's all you needed. And what's what's also interesting is that back then, the attrition rate for the law school was about 50%. So just going to law school alone, in the absence of anything else, the probability of your ending up with a law degree was 50-50. Okay. But anyway, on February 26, 1946, what has been called the Great Day, and I think that's a chapter in my book, The Great Day, Sweatt and a delegation met with Theophilus Painter and 3 other staff members in Room 1, which is today the registrar's office. Sweatt asked to be admitted to the law school, and he handed his Wiley College transcript to Painter. Painter said he would seek an attorney general's opinion. And when he handed it over to the Attorney General, Grover Sellis, who happened to be running for governor at the time, he said, "Heman Sweatt will never darken the halls of the University of Texas." It would be, I guess there would be some justice in believing that when Mr. Sweatt handed his transcript over to Painter, that he would have caught Painter by surprise or outsmarted him in some way. And I just can't make myself believe that because of, number one, where the meeting was held, and number two, who was there. I believe Painter knew all along what was going on. Now, he may not have known that it was Heman Sweatt per se who was going to actually apply, but he knew something in admissions was up because that's where the meeting was held. And he had with him the Dean of Admissions. The account of that famous meeting is almost outrageous, because even by 1940 standards, the president and especially the 2 staff members who were there were rather condescending and rather patronizing. They told Sweatt, you need to think about this. Think of all the progress we're making. A new university is being built for African Americans and all this other stuff. And what they didn't seem to understand is that they were threatening the removal of something that the African American community, in fact, never had. They had been promised a university in the Constitution of 1876. And by 1946, it still wasn't around. So explain to me, what am I going to lose now? Surely they must have thought that, although they didn't say it out loud. On June 17th, 1946, in the 126th court, Judge Roy Archer ruled that Texas had failed to provide a substantially equal law school for African American Texans, but he didn't order Sweatt admitted. He basically said, Texas, you've got 6 months to set up a law school for Mr. Sweatt and other African Americans who reside in this state. When 6 months later came along, there still wasn't a law school, but the judge said, well, you've made sufficient progress. Just make sure you have something by February 1st. See, back then, there were 3 major semesters. You know, now we have summer, now we have fall and spring, and then a half semester in the summer. But back then, because of the war, there were 3 semesters, so to speak. And the semester he's talking about begins in February. So on February 1st, the state opened up the Prairie View Law School in Houston. This law school, which was supposed to be substantially equal to the University of Texas Law School, was basically consisted of the office of 2 black attorneys, both of whom specialized in divorce. That was supposed to be substantially equal to the 75-year-old University of Texas Law School. Okay. On February 10th, the deadline for applying, Thurgood Marshall filed an appeal in state appeals court, and then the appeal was based on the obvious. It's not, it may be separate, but it's certainly not equal. But it's all moot point anyway, because nobody applied. The law school on February 14th had to close because not a single applicant applied to this sham law school. And it was because Lula White and Thurgood Marshall organized a boycott that seemed to be pretty successful. And so, on March 3rd, Governor Jester signed into law Senate Bill 140, which created what was called then the Texas State University for Negroes. Today, it is Texas Southern University. And the registrar sent Heman Sweatt a letter informing him that he had been accepted to the TSUN Law School, this time in Austin. Here's another little interesting tidbit. Heman Marion Sweatt was accepted to a law school he never applied to. Well, okay, let's just presume that in the first place that makes some sense. The Attorney General Price Daniel, in a surprise move, agreed with Marshall to petition the Court of Appeals to remand Sweatt. Wait a minute, let's go back to the district court and let's have a trial. Both sides agreed to it. It's one of the few things they agreed on. Okay, why? Why would you want to go back to district court and do this all over again? Price Daniels had in the back of his mind, I'll have a little bit more time to set up something separate and maybe more equal to the law offices of a couple of attorneys who specialize in divorce. And so, here is where we have the famous basement school. This is a picture from the court record right here. This is the office building of a petroleum engineering firm, which, as you can see, is what, 2 or 3 stories tall. And in order to get to the new Texas State University for Negroes Law School, you walk down the sidewalk right here and down a step to a porch, to this door, 2 steps down, you go through the door, you're in the basement school. There's been a lot of fussing and fighting over the years as to whether or not it was really in a basement. Is it really in a basement? To me, that's all besides the point. Because the sin is not the fact that you're in a basement. The sin is segregation. We could argue that the UT main building, we could argue that my office is in a basement, because if you walk into the first floor from the south, you're on the first floor, you have to go down some stairs to get to the ground floor, and I'm saying, who cares? But it was a great strategic move in court, because Thurgood Marshall called it a basement, and to this day we call it the basement school. All right, and it all depends on what you call a basement, I guess. When I was growing up in Louisiana, the nuns who taught me were from Massachusetts, and they used to ask me, "Do you need to go to the basement?" What? The basement? What is that? Well, they were referring to the restroom. They call up where they were from, the basement was a restroom. It's all right. Isn't this fascinating? Okay. But this is why Sweatt matters from an historical standpoint. Why did Thurgood Marshall agree to remand back to trial? He agreed to remand back to trial because he had decided that equalization just didn't work anymore. We will never have separate and truly equal, even if you count all the bricks and all the books and all the money and all the floor space and the teacher-pupil ratio. Right about this time, Thurgood Marshall says, those are just things. And so Marshall agrees to remand back to court because now he can go from equalization to a direct attack on segregation, and he doesn't have to find a new plaintiff. And so he writes to his colleague, William Henry Hastie, whether we want it or not, we are faced with the proposition of going into the question of segregation. And so the direct attack, this is why Sweatt v. Painter is so historically significant. See, Gynes said that a state had to provide individuals a separate but equal education within their own borders. Sipewell said it had to be at the same time. Both of those cases kind of presume that separate and equal is possible. It was Sweatt that argued that separate but equal was inherently unequal. Now, there was a case in federal district court in California where those issues were discussed. Mendez v. Westminster, I think it was. It's a little bit different here, but the Mendez case is also the first case in which the sociological argument was brought forth. See, Sweatt testified that he would not find any separate law school acceptable under any circumstances. In court, he said, I do not believe in segregation. Separate is inherently unequal. But Mr. Sweatt had a problem. When his case first started and when he was first deposed, it was an equalization case. And he signed an affidavit that said that if a separate and truly equal law school could be configured for him, that he would go to it. It's in his deposition. Okay. Well, when Price Daniels pointed that out in court, Sweatt and Thurgood Marshall had a very simple answer. I changed my mind. I changed my mind. And Durham gets up and he said, Your Honor, our client has a right to change his mind. And Judge Archer says, he does have a right to change his mind. And he did. And the rest is history. Okay? On September 8th, 1947, the Texas State University for Negroes opens up in Houston. Today, it's Texas Southern University. It has the distinction, another one of these little ironies here. The Texas State University for Negroes must be the only institution, at least I've ever heard of, that had a law school before a math department. It had a law school before an English department. They had a law school before they had a campus. It was in the basement, but that's where it was. On the 25th of February, the Court of Civil Appeals upholds the district court, the Supreme Court upholds the appeals court, and another one of those ironies is that, of course, Thurgood Marshall counted on losing. One of the more complicating factors in all this is if he had actually won in a Texas state court, then the case would probably have ended and all of that work would have been limited to progress in the state of Texas itself. He was a lawyer who wanted to establish the record. You see, what's important about this is you establish the record and you end up in the United States Supreme Court where you have a shot. It would have been interesting if Texas had actually ruled in his favor. He'd probably have to go to another state and find another plaintiff. And now we get down to what Dr. Vinson was talking about just now. We counted equality, we measured equality in the past by looking at books and money. We looked at faculty, those things that could be objectively measured. In Sweatt versus Painter, the Supreme Court said, what is more important, the University of Texas Law School possesses to a far greater degree those qualities which are incapable of objective measurement, but which make for greatness in a law school. And here is why Sweatt matters. Such qualities, to name but a few, include the reputation of the faculty, the experience of the administration. This is a big one. Position and influence of the alumni, standing in the community, traditions, and prestige. Why is that important? Because, and here's a quote from my book, how could Texas create something acceptably separate for African Americans and Mr. Sweatt? How can you create a school where none exists before that has alumni? How can you create a school where none existed before that has a reputation equal to the University of Texas Law School, which has been around for something like 75 years or so? How can you do that? Well, guess what? You can't. Thurgood Marshall said that now Plessy versus Ferguson is gutted. And this is 4 years before Brown. How could the state of Texas create a law school for Negroes where none had existed before, with alumni of position and influence, and one that was equal to the 67-year-old UT Law School? The court consciously undermined Plessy v. Ferguson, as Justice Tom Clark, a graduate of UT Law School, had suggested, and graduate and professional school education by setting an impossible subjective standard for equality. And Tom Clark said it himself. Now, this is a guy who voted in both the Sweatt and in the Brown cases. He said, in fact, not in Brown, as people say, did we overrule Plessy. We implicitly overruled Plessy in Sweatt and Painter. The law school, the proving ground for legal learning and practice, cannot be effective in isolation from individuals and institutions with which the law interacts. Few students and no one who has practiced the law would choose to study in an academic vacuum, removed from the interplay of ideas and the exchange of views with which the law is concerned. Now, look at that carefully. It cannot be effective in isolation from individuals and institutions with which the law interacts. At the beginning of this process, the entire state of Texas had 26 African American attorneys, or something like that. By this time, there might have been 30 or 40. But the point is, how can you teach someone the law when you're denying them access to the ideas they'll need to be effective in the first place? And you think about that. And to me, what's instructive as an admissions officer to this day, it was in this case that the justices said, removed from the interplay of ideas and the exchange of views. Today, in cases like Bakke and Gruder, as an admissions officer, I look back at this and I say, you know, this is really the first time the court is saying that you have a civil right, or a right of some sort, to access to ideas. And how can you do that in a segregated situation? That's why Sweatt and Painter matters. And in some ways, I hasten to add, I'm not an attorney, I'm an admissions officer, okay? But, and attorneys would probably tear me to shreds over this, but what I'm saying is that when you start talking about the interplay of ideas, I think of the Bakke case and the Gruder case, which basically says that institutions have a compelling interest to have diversity in their classes in order to have that interplay of ideas, in order to have that robust classroom discussion. How can you not? How can you deny educational benefits to something like that? And then what Sweatt started in motion, which led to Brown, was, and this is a quote from my book, if the desegregation of graduate and professional schools was necessary because students could not be treated equally when separated from 85% of the people they would eventually have to work with, then under what other circumstances in life could racial segregation be acceptable? How could such logic not be applied to elementary and secondary education, business, and all levels of government? Within a week, Sweatt got a letter from Marshall. He had gotten a phone call right when the Supreme Court ruled. The phone rang, Sweatt answers, and it's this big booming voice of Thurgood Marshall who said, "We won the big one. We won the big one. You are entitled to the fullest credit for a job well done. If it had not been for your courage and refusal to be swayed by others, this victory would not have been possible." Heman Marion Sweatt was the ideal plaintiff. On September 19th, this is a famous picture of Mr. Sweatt in line. When I look at this picture, I have to be honest with you, I'm distracted by the guy in the Coke bottle. I mean, I wonder who that is. Well, anyway, you see him in class here. And when he got to the registration table, he completed this card right here. It's very historic. And this guy, and this is his own handwriting. This guy knew how to print, man. I tell you what. About a month later, some people took 2 4x4 timbers about 6 feet tall, and they tried to plant it in the ground. It's where the business school is today. The law school used to be where the business school is, on the corner of Speedway and 21st. They tried to put it in the ground, but these poor fools didn't know that you don't have to go very far to hit solid rock. And so they took some scaffolding and put it all together and leaned it up against the scaffolding, soaked it in kerosene, and set it on fire. Like all other big stories in our history, there's a lot of folklore that has gone on with a lot of things associated with Sweatt's matriculation here. What we know is that it happened. There was a cross burning on October 17th, 1950, and it's interesting Sweatt's reaction to it. When interviewed by the newspaper, he was quoted as saying, he says, I don't know what's going on. We had a very, very good day, lively classroom discussions. And he was very dismissive of it. And maybe that was in his nature. The one thing, a very valuable lesson that this man could teach us all. In the news today, we hear about civility. Let's return to civility. Let's not talk at one another, let's talk to one another. And I want to tell you something. If you want a lesson in civility, then you study the life of Heman Marion Sweatt. I have not encountered, in 5 years of research, I never encountered a single moment where this man returned hatred with more hatred. I could not uncover a single quote where he denigrated anyone, even the most vile racists who threatened him, or the state of Texas, or the University of Texas. This was a very, very gracious man. In the summer of 1952, he dropped out, and there were many, many complicated reasons for that. He was never a very healthy individual as far as I can tell. And we have a lot of doctors in here who could probably shed some light on that. He had financial problems. He had personal problems. And if you put all of that together, you know, the guy didn't have much of a chance. But the news ends up being pretty good, because not long after he dropped out here at UT Austin, Whitney Young offered him a full scholarship for a master's degree in social work at Atlanta University, where he earned his master's degree. And he later accepted a position with the Urban League in Cleveland, and 8 years later, he relocated to the Atlanta office. In 1964, by that time, he had remarried, and his daughter, Hemela, who is now a physician in Cincinnati, Ohio, she was born, and she shared with me a letter he wrote to her on September 30th, 1982. Hemela, my dearest daughter, as soon as I regain my strength, I'm going to join some church and try to find for myself the happiness I have known in my life before having to be upset by some of the experiences of my day-to-day life. I am going to get out and live differently for the happiness I still hope to find. 4 days later, he died of a massive heart attack at the home of his friend in Atlanta, Georgia. His cremated remains are in Paradise North Cemetery in Houston, and he lies right next to Papa Sweatt. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Gary's too modest to do this, so I will do it for him, and I'm not going to get a cut of this, but I just want you to know that you should go out and on Amazon or directly, and again, I can pledge that Gary will personally sign any book that you purchase, and it is well worth it. I want to share that it is an outstanding book, and it is no surprise that Gary's book earned the Coral Horton Tullis Book Award from the Texas Historical Association, and you'll receive that in March for the best book on Texas history. And can we give Gary again a round of applause?
Thank you.
Gary, I think we have a little time for some Q&A, so I'm going to bring you back up and see if anyone has any questions.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
Why did they select the black attorneys in Houston office? Who arranged it? Who made that arrangement?
The logic, as you know, perverted as it is, the logic was that Houston was an ideal location for any African American professional school because it had a large African American population, and Houston was one of the few places that had a community of black professionals. There were like 22 physicians. So when the time would come eventually, so the logic went to create a black medical school, then there would be physicians there to do the teaching. But, and here's another irony in my book there. So after all of these years of Jim Crowism, the Anglo establishment painted itself in a corner because they had denied professional and graduate school education to African Americans for so long when they needed faculty to teach the stuff they didn't have any. So, but to directly answer your question, Houston was the largest city at the time with the largest African American population, and there were at least some professionals there who could serve as faculty. It wasn't enough. Austin, for example, wasn't a large enough city. There was, in Austin at that time, there was one black attorney. Well, he couldn't be a law school all by himself. Yes.
The thought was that they could establish a school in Houston. Heman would remain in Houston.
That's right.
And make it more convenient for him to stay in Houston and not come to Austin.
Right. I mean, that university, and Mr. Sweatt's pointing this out very nicely, that university was built a half a mile from Mr. Sweatt's home, which is still there, as a matter of fact. You know? Yes?
Has the university bestowed an honorary degree for the family in its memory or anything like that?
I don't know, Greg, did you know? No. Well, I can answer no, they haven't. And I don't know if there are any plans for that. I think maybe that question would be directed to who?
The University of Texas does not confer honorary degrees.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
How much of the success of Sweatt versus Painter do you attribute to Sweatt's attitude throughout the court process in his first day at the DT?
Well, pretty much all of it, you know, because I think Gines and some other plaintiffs, what I think Marshall and the NAACP understood was that the plaintiff had to be, number one, qualified, which he you know, even Painter, when he wrote the letter to the Attorney General, said this person is qualified in every respect, save and but for the fact that he is a Negro. Okay. Now, a plaintiff was in a position to drop the case at any time. And that's the one thing that Marshall and the NAACP could not afford. Because lawyers, as I understand it, they have an ethical responsibility to their client and to no one else. As a matter of fact, at the Law School of the South in Houston not very long ago, I gave a lecture to a bunch of attorneys who debated among themselves, all right, who is your client, Mr. Marshall? Is it Heman Marion Sweatt? Is it the NAACP? African Americans of Texas, who's your client? Well, the client is Heman Marion Sweatt. And if they had offered him the basement school, if he had decided he wanted to go there and get his law degree, that case is over. Okay? On the other hand, and the Attorney General, Price Daniel, during trial, accused Thurgood Marshall of exactly that thing. The only person, though, withstanding to complain against Marshall would be Sweatt, and he didn't do it. So yeah, the plaintiff matters. Okay? Yes?
Just clarification. Who was the attorney of record for Mr. Sweatt? Was it Thurgood Marshall or was it William Durham?
That was a very large issue at trial. Price Daniels was arguing that all of the trouble was coming from New York, right? And embodied by Mr. Marshall. When Sweatt was called to testify, he was asked pointedly, who is your lawyer? His testimony was, my lawyer is William Durham of Dallas. Okay? And I authorized, this is the important part, I authorized Mr. Durham to do whatever he has to do, use whatever sources he has to use.
Whatever consultants.
Exactly. And Mr. Durham consulted with Mr. Marshall. Yeah.
But I think it's important. It depends on which case you're talking about. The Supreme Court case, Thurgood Marshall was the attorney of record that argued, because there's a primary person. Thurgood Marshall was that person who was the attorney of record that argued for the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court.
And in district court, it was William Durham. And it is not unusual at all for an appellate attorney to take over once you've left the district court. Any other questions? Okay, I think we have an announcement. Oh,
Delegated to.
you've been delegated to do that? Okay.
You're authorized.
Yeah, where we can get the books, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So as I mentioned, I put in the plug. And so where can you purchase a book right now? And you can do that right now. We're going to have a book signing with our distinguished author in May 12th. And so you can go over and purchase the book as well as get the rest of the Sweatt Symposium event. This evening, we have an outstanding program where you'll get to hear from the family. So I encourage you to go over. That'll be over at Carter's Hall this evening. So I look forward to having you over there. I know you will enjoy that. On February 24th at noon, here at the same room, although we might need to think about that. We have Dr. George Wright, who's the president of Prairie University and was a professor here and an administrator here for a number of years, and Dr. Ed Sharp, who is also a senior administrator and professor, will speak about the genesis of the Sweatt Symposium, and you will be in for a real treat. Thinking about lineage, Dr. Wright was a protege of one of the great American historians, John Hope Franklin, and was an outstanding teacher here. And Dr. Sharp has truly been an ally, continues to be an ally for equity and access here at the University of Texas at Austin. And so I know you all will enjoy that. Also on March 24th, in the governor's room, we have Miss Louise Isco, who is the author of The Overcoming, A History of Black Integration at the University of Texas at Austin. And she will be interviewed by Dr. Kevin Michael Foster, who's a professor here at the university, to talk about her views on the community climate during the university's integration and future plans to update her work. On Thursday, April 14th, here in the Union, the Cordangle Room, you have Shades of Diversity, bringing the civil rights movement forward, feminism in today's world. UT Austin faculty will discuss the role of feminist analysis in contemporary civil rights issues as it pertains to areas such as the arts, business, education, and religion, spirituality. And then finally, the culminating event will be a special evening of honors. So get your tuxes and your best dresses out on Friday, May 6th at 7 p.m. at the Alumni Center. And this is where we will have the opportunity to honor a number of pioneers who have made this campus not only the great university that it is, but to live up to its true mission. And so I want to thank you all again for coming out. I look forward to seeing you all over at Main 12 as we get to spend a little bit more time with Gary. And can we give Gary and the Sweatt family another